Guys, boxing gossip coming to you on a Tuesday night. For a start, a little bit of a disclaimer. I am feeling absolutely terrible. I've got a bad case of the man flu, so apologise if I look terrible and sound terrible in this video. I'm afraid it's worse for me than it is for you. Believe me on that. First and foremost, the boxing betting bulletin, which was due up yesterday, Monday evening, did not go up. That was because I was feeling too ill to record a video. And secondly, it was because, having considered that concept, I actually think it's better to do it at the end of the week. And the reason for that is, sometimes if you do it on a Monday, typically you're talking about fights that take place on a Saturday or on a Friday, and the odds aren't fully released. Not every bookmaker's priced it up. Sometimes it helps to come up with the bets after you've seen the weigh-ins or after you've seen the press conference, etc. So the boxing betting bulletin is here to stay. I'm going to do one back end of this week, probably Friday night, maybe Saturday morning, and it's going to have a new regular home towards the end of the week. So it's not going anywhere. I'm not quitting it as an idea. It just didn't happen this week because I was ill, and I think probably for the long term it's best not to do it on Mondays anyway. One other quick bit of news is that we've got, I've put my social media links in the description button below. I'm going to try and build out my Twitter followers and my Facebook, etc. So if you're a fan of the channel and you haven't already done so, please take the time to add me on Facebook. There's a link below, or follow me on Twitter, which is @BoxingGossip. Anyway, let's talk heavyweights. The news is out that Wlad Klitschko will not be fighting Anthony Joshua. Now, long-term viewers to the channel will know that myself and the majority of the guys on the podcast have been predicting that would be the case for several weeks. To be brutally honest, the fight never made sense to myself. I never saw it as a fight that was sensible for either party to take. So I'm really not surprised that the fight hasn't happened. Eddie Hearn is now talking about potentially signing the fight at this point for spring of next year. Now we'll come on to that in just a second. Let's first say that Klitschko's been ruled out of any fight, not just the Joshua fight, the Lucas Brown fight, fighting any opponent because of a calf injury. Now, when we look back to Klitschko versus Tyson Fury, I believe that fight was November 2015. That fight split people. 50% of people for Father Time had caught up with Vladimir, and Vladimir was a shot fighter. Now, if you sit in that 50% camp, and I don't, but if you sit in that 50% camp, you must think Vladimir literally has no chance in 2017 against a guy like Anthony Joshua. Because let's be honest, if the guy was completely shot and too old to box late 2015, a year and a half of inactivity, a severe injury, and an opponent against a guy like Anthony Joshua in your 40s, the guy's got very little chance. Then you've got the other 50%, which is where I sit, who believe that Wlad Klitschko didn't get older overnight, that Wlad Klitschko is still an elite heavyweight, and that Wlad Klitschko was beaten by a better man on the night who just stylistically had the beating of him. Now, what I would say, even if you sit in that 50%, and I do, this has to be a concern for Wlad Klitschko, because they say the only undefeated fighter in boxing is Father Time. And no matter how good we think Wlad Klitschko is, no matter how convinced we are that he was just outfoxed by Tyson Fury, Wlad Klitschko is just a man, same as you, same as I. And now in his 40s, having had another injury, having been inactive for so long, Father Time is certainly going to be catching up with him. Now, I'm not ruling Wlad Klitschko out. What I am saying is this delay makes me less confident that his return to the ring will be successful, because every day that passes, Wlad Klitschko is getting older. And sometimes, if you imagine it as a graph, when a boxer gets old, it's not always a slow, graceful decline like this. Sometimes it's a bell curve. Sometimes they peak, they start to decline, and then they drop. Not always the way. Look at Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins is in a slow, graceful decline. But sometimes it can go the other way. Sometimes a fighter can be on his peak, get old overnight, and it can be like a bell curve. And who knows with Vladimir Klitschko? Klitschko's always going to be a dangerous fighter. He's mastered his style, he's got superb technique, he's athletic, he trains very hard, he carries immense power, and power is the last thing to go. But this is a concern for me when we talk about Vladimir Klitschko potentially returning to the sport. Now, let's talk about Hearn's comments that he will look to make this fight from March to April 2017 and sign it at this point. I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that to be hype and fabrication. A guy like Vladimir Klitschko is notoriously difficult to negotiate a contract with. Always has been. Do we really see Vladimir Klitschko signing away himself to fight an opponent in 6 months' time when Anthony Joshua's got another fight on the horizon? Is Klitschko going to take that risk? Is he going to sign up a contract without seeing how Joshua performs in that fight in late December? Is he going to tie himself down to a fight in 6 months' time when there may be so many other lucrative potential options that open themselves up to him? I just don't believe that it's going to be realistic in this day and age that a guy like Vladimir Klitschko is going to sign a contract 6 months in advance of a fight when the opponent's got another fight in between. I just don't see Vladimir operating in that manner, I'm afraid. Now, I may be wrong, but that's my perception. Whilst people have bought into this fight, and whilst people obviously do believe that there's genuine interest in making it, I still don't think it adds up. Klitschko is such a risky opponent from Anthony Joshua's perspective, and with the fact that he now has lost to Tyson Fury and now doesn't bring belts to the table, the risk-reward ratio doesn't add up. I mean, sure, Vladimir Klitschko is a huge name, and a fight against Anthony Joshua would be box office and do well globally. But would it do as well as a fight with Deontay Wilder? Would it do as well as a fight with David Haye? I'm unsure. Commercially, I think those guys are as strong a brands as Vladimir Klitschko. And with Klitschko no longer bringing a belt to the party, I just wonder whether it's as interesting to Anthony Joshua and Joshua's camp. If they win the fight, if they beat Klitschko in devastating fashion, there will be a large proportion of the public who say, oh, Klitschko was old 18 months ago when Tyson Fury beat him. I just don't see the risk-reward for that fight adding up. So my prediction is that all of this talk of them signing the fight for April of next year won't actually happen. I predict that we won't see Vladimir put pen to paper at this stage. But let me know your thoughts on that. Eddie Hearn's now in a position where he is looking at making a fight for December the 10th. Now, today's date is October the 25th, so we have got 6 days left in October, 30 days in November, and 10 days in December. So what's that? That's 46 days, which is less than 7 weeks. So just got a Harley Davidson going outside my flat, good timing. But less than 7 weeks to this fight now, which is becoming relatively late notice, especially if you consider that the opponent will have a large amount of press commitments in the last week. So that opponent who Joshua is going to fight will probably be taking the fight on 5 to 6 weeks notice, which isn't ideal. It isn't ideal. And Eddie Hearn and Team Joshua seem to be putting 3 names out there: David Price, Bryant Jennings, Eric Molina. I don't see where the hype with Bryant Jennings has come from. Bryant Jennings is a good fighter, he's a likeable fighter, but he's lost his last 2 fights. And more importantly, he's not in the IBF top 15. I don't believe a guy like Bryant Jennings would even be eligible to fight Anthony Joshua in a voluntary, because the rules are that the opponent has to come from that top 15 pool. So I don't see why Bryant Jennings' name is in the mix. If I've got something wrong, please leave it in the comment section below. But as far as I'm aware, Bryant Jennings is not in the top 15. And given the fact that he's been inactive and he's coming off back-to-back defeats, I can't see how they would promote him to being in that top 15. So the link with Bryant Jennings is, for me, false. And whilst I like Bryant Jennings, and whilst I actually think he's a good fighter, surely he needs to come back and get 1 or 2 wins under his belt, rather than just being brought in as a late notice opponent and an underdog again. Eric Molina and David Price are the 2 fights that I see as more realistic. You know, we've already discussed the David Price fight on this channel. Price, very marketable in the UK. Big guy, huge puncher, Olympian, well known to the British public already. Domestic heavyweight class. The David Price fight makes commercial sense. In terms of pay-per-view sales, David Price will do more than Eric Molina, Brian Jennings. Eric Molina, I've got to be honest, nice guy, coming off a good win against Thomas Adamek. I don't really have interest in seeing that fight. For me, Molina is a guy who is sort of the elite level of the sport. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want to suggest that Molina was you know, a lower opponent than a Dillian White or a Charles Martin or a Dominic Breazeale, but I think he's more exposed than those guys. I think going into the fight, we know there's already a big ceiling over Molina's career. I think the common consensus would be that Molina is not going to be a top 10 heavyweight. And that's no disrespect to him, he's a good fighter, he's solid, he's a solid top 30 heavyweight. Does he have the skill, the technique, the defence to beat a guy like Anthony Joshua? I doubt it. Of course, he's a big guy, he just scored a big knockout over Thomas Adamek. Does he have a puncher's chance? Yes. Is he ultra marketable? Is he really going to sell a fight? For me, no. So I suspect that whilst Molina will be a reserve option, this fight could well be headed in the David Price direction, and we could well be seeing Anthony Joshua versus David Price. You know, the fact that David Price has been on short notice, well, David Price has been talking about fighting Anthony Joshua for a little while. He's been active. He's had 2 warm-up fights recently. We know he's been in the gym. We know he's been in camp. The fact it's a slightly sort of formal notice is probably not to his detriment. You know, from Eddie Hearn's perspective, it's a big pay-per-view to end the year. And I know people are going to hate on it and people are going to criticise me for saying it's a pay-per-view in the chat. But let's take emotion out of it. This sells on pay-per-view. It really does. David Price is easy to market. And the casual fan will really buy into this fight. Who doesn't love a domestic heavyweight class? I suspect we're headed in the direction of David Price. Interesting that Klitschko's out of action. The other quandary that throws up is the WBA belt. There seems to be a huge amount of names in that WBA mix. Luis Ortiz, Lucas Brown, Fraser Quendo, Alexander Ustinov. Another man who's in the mix there is David Haye. You know, I did a video a week or so ago, David Haye is an evil genius. Look at the options available to the guy. Huge pay-per-view fight with Tony Bellew. WBO world title shot against the winner of Parker Ruiz. Potentially, David Haye could fight a Lucas Brown for the vacant WBA title. And that's a fight that he'd be a heavyweight and heavy favourite in. So I just wanted to record this video really to sort of put some thoughts down. But in summary, interesting to see what happens to the WBA mix now. Will we see Brown versus Haye? Very possible. Interesting to see what happens with Joshua now. I'm going Price most likely. Molina is a reserve option and Brian Jennings is a complete red herring. As for Klitschko versus Joshua, I don't believe we'll ever see that fight. But even if we do, don't expect it to be signed in advance of Joshua fighting on December the 10th. I think that's unrealistic. I think that's hype. And I'd be very, very surprised if that happened. As always, guys, leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed this video, please take the time to hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Many thanks for watching and hope everyone is feeling better than I am today. Cheers.